I used to work the graveyard shift at a Dunkin' Donuts. For those of you who don't know what a Dunkin' Donuts is, it's basically a donut chain that sells coffee, breakfast items, and of course, donuts. It didn't always used to have a night shift though. Originally, my location had regular hours with regular customers throughout the day. Overall, it was a simple job. Make sure everything was stocked, clean, and make sure the coffee was fresh. Pretty much the only downside, apart from working the morning shift, was dealing with the ungrateful customers. Most of the time, it was a rushed businessman who didn't have time to wait 5 minutes for a simple cup of coffee. Or an entitled soccer mom who would lose her mind on us over a piece of cheese on a sandwich which she didn't want. After working in the food industry for a few months, I had acquired a newfound respect for the people who work in this industry. Everyone is just trying their best. And yes, mistakes do happen, but almost every time, mistakes can and do get fixed on the spot. I've had my share of hostile interactions from customers too. One time, during my first week of working there, I accidentally dropped a cup of coffee while handing it to a customer. Luckily, it didn't spill on them. It slipped and fell to the ground, out of the way. Watching that cup fall from my hands was like slow motion. The guy who I was handing the cup to was actually very polite and laughed it off, whereas his girlfriend was livid. She actually threatened to drag me out back and boil me in hot coffee just to see how I'd like it. It was a good thing my manager was there and saw the whole thing. He apologized profusely to the couple and gave them complimentary coffee and sandwiches. Suffice to say, I never dropped another cup after that. Another incident that happened was when a woman ordered a cup of coffee. She quickly took a drink from it and then immediately threw the coffee back at me. She said it was far too hot and that we were trying to kill her. It was a good thing I was wearing an apron or else I'd have a whole different set of problems. This brings me to a little over a month ago when our location was recently selected to become 24 hours. A lot of other establishments would maintain a 24-hour drive-through window, but ours was fully open. I'll be honest, it was interesting to see the new types of customers who would come in during these hours. We of course had the hipsters and goths who had nothing better to do at 3 a.m. than to sit in a coffee shop drinking one cup for an hour. There were the occasional overworked businessmen and interns, trying desperately to finish that last-minute presentation. We'd get the graveyard shift workers stopping in to get their much-needed caffeine fix. And once in a while, a husband or boyfriend who had got thrown into the doghouse would show up. When we were notified of this new schedule, we were initially asked to volunteer for the graveyard shift. I knew it would take some getting used to, but in my mind, the minimal workload would be worth it. So I immediately offered to take the night shift. Everything was going well for the first 2 weeks or so. The customers I told you about earlier had started becoming a part of my nightly routine. The best part about working the night shift is that almost everyone was either too tired or too apathetic to be rude or hostile towards us. I think the biggest gripe we got was from a hipster asking if we had any 100% grass-fed organic sugarcane. To which I responded to him that this was a Dunkin' Donuts. He just huffed as he stared into his cup and then walked away. A couple weeks ago, I had encountered a new type of customer, though he is very difficult to describe. Have you ever met someone that makes you nervous for some unknown reason? Well, at around 2:30 a.m., a man walked in with a large overcoat, with the collar pulled up, and a black beanie on his head. What struck me as odd first was the lack of people in our lobby. Normally at this time, we'd have the goths huddled in the corner cursing the system or something. But the entire store was empty aside from this man, myself, and my manager who was in the back, probably sleeping or something. After this person walked in, I thought it had to be a homeless man, trying to escape the cold and possibly seek out a hot cup of pity. But then I saw his face. He was somewhat gaunt, but cleanly shaven. His eyes had dark circles around them as if he were tired, but he seemed quite energized. He then walked up to the counter. At that moment, I realized how tall this guy was. Like Kobe tall. I asked him what he would like to order. He just stared straight ahead as if he were zoning out. I repeated my question a bit louder. He only said one word.
Coffee.
His voice was harsh and grating, like he had been screaming recently. Not wanting to risk more awkwardness, I didn't ask him about any flavors or sizes. I quickly grabbed a fresh cup of black coffee and set it in front of him. The man then leaned down and looked me in the eye and asked me if I was alone. I told him I wasn't, that my manager was in the back room. He then pulled out a few crumpled up dollar bills, handed it to me, and then walked back out of the door without taking his coffee with him. As soon as he left the building, I felt this intense atmosphere lift up from around me. I was at a loss for words, to be honest. I quickly rushed to the back and told my manager about the whole situation, to which he told me to put the man's money aside in case he comes back for it. The next night, everything was back to normal. The usual customers sat in their respective seats, sipping their coffee. While I was keeping myself busy and mopping the floor, I couldn't help but think about the interaction I had last night. That's when I happened to look out of our front window. And I saw him. He was standing across the street under a streetlight. He was just standing there staring at me. I turned to see if my manager was behind the counter, and when I looked back, he was gone. At that point, I was starting to feel unnerved, but it wasn't until the following night that I became downright terrified. I was busy stocking some shelves in the back when I heard the front doorbell ring. I quickly rushed out of the back, but I stopped in my tracks when I saw the man standing in front of me. He looked terrible. His previously shaven face was covered in patchy stubble. His cheeks looked much thinner than last time, and his eyes looked lifeless. I asked the man if he was all right, but he didn't reply. He just stood there in the lobby staring at me once again. I told him I was going to call the police so they could come help him. As soon as I grabbed the phone from the counter, the man charged at me. He grabbed me by the throat and threw me to the ground. After hearing the commotion, my manager burst from the back room and demanded an explanation. In a panic, I told him to call the police, but it was only then I realized the man who had grabbed me had disappeared. I called out of work for the next 2 nights. I just needed some time to recover from that whole encounter. I still probably should have had my manager call the police the other night, but reasoned in my head that the guy was probably long gone. My last night working there was the worst by far, and also the reason I quit. I had arrived to work and relieved the people working before me. That's when I received a call from my manager telling me that he had a family emergency and would be a few hours late. I was upset, but there wasn't much I could do, so I just said all right. After 3 uneventful hours of me cleaning the same racks over and over again to keep my mind off things, I glanced out of the window once more. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The man was standing on the other side of the window. He was grinning at me with a sinister smile that caused my body to seize up. Right away, I pulled out my cell phone and called the police. While my phone was ringing, the man did something strange. Without peeling his eyes from the glass, he pulled out a cell phone from his pocket. I watched him carefully as he began to type something into the phone without even looking at it. At that moment, my phone buzzed, notifying me of a text. The message said, "Now you're alone." It was then I noticed that the text came from my manager's phone. Immediately, I ran into the back office and locked the door. At that point, the dispatch operator had answered and I told him about my current situation. As I spoke to them, I could hear the front doorbell ring. I could hear heavy footsteps walking into the back area. The operator told me that 2 police cars were already on their way. The man began pounding on the door, trying to break it down. I screamed from the other side that I called the police and that they were almost here. Then the banging stopped. The police arrived a few minutes later but found no traces of the man and took my statement. They asked me where my manager was and I told them I had no idea, but that I thought the guy had done something to him. The police escorted me home and told me they would keep in touch. A week or so had passed, I never went back to work and I never saw the man again. I did receive a call from one of the officers, however. He told me that they found my manager's car in a ditch on some back road, but he was nowhere to be found. He also told me that the security footage we had in the store had somehow been corrupted and was now unusable. I don't know who or what that thing was, or why it targeted me. But I know one thing for sure. I'm never working the graveyard shift anywhere, ever again.